Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Jonathan Hollerman. I'm the Deputy Director at the EMP Task Force, and today we've got a great interview with David Pyne. He is the Executive Director at the Task Force as well. He's a national security strategist, and he's the editor of the Real War newsletter. Sorry, David. Nice to have you on.
Great to be on with you, Jonathan.
So yeah, I wanted to have you on. There's some big stuff happening in the news, some current events that we should talk about, and let's just go ahead and dig right in. Let's discuss this attack that was in Moscow. So just for background, I have always been saying since the Ukrainian war started, since the first month of the Ukrainian war, I have always been telling my followers on Patreon and the people that follow my newsletter, hey, I'm not as concerned what's happening inside Ukraine. I am primarily focused on what's happening in Russia. If there are major attacks, infrastructure attacks inside Russia that escalate, if Ukraine takes the war from inside Ukraine to Russia specifically, and we've seen that escalating more lately. They've been hitting different facilities in Russia, and I think some of the weapons they use, the medium range weapons, were U.S. supplied weapons. My stance has always been if the war ends up on the motherland in Russia, they're going to blame us, and they could absolutely escalate. So with that in mind, let's discuss what just recently broke. If you want to share with the viewers here the latest news from the last 24 hours.
Yeah, so there was a huge terrorist attack that impacted a Moscow concert hall in which 133 Russian civilians were killed. Russia's never seen a mass terror attack on this scale, I think, ever. ISIS has claimed responsibility. I think ISIS-K is claimed responsibility for the attack. But just breaking news, Russia is alleging, likely correctly, Ukrainian ties for the ISIS terrorists. They're saying that the ISIS terrorists, were driving in a car with Ukrainian license plates, that they were based out of Ukraine. They were trying to flee across the Russo-Ukrainian border back to, I guess, the Ukrainian support base. And this is, I think that's the most likely possibility. Now, my first thought, to be honest, was that it could have been a Russian false flag event. But when I saw ISIS claim responsibility, the chances of this being a Russian false flag event, decreased to near zero. So I think we have to assume that in this case, at least, the Russian narrative is likely correct, and this is going to be used as a pretext for Putin to massively escalate the war in Ukraine. And we saw that. I actually read, before I heard of the terror attack, I heard the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, state that the Russian special military operation in Ukraine had ended, and that this was officially now considered a war with NATO, a proxy war with NATO in Ukraine. And there's, a lot of, the lay public, American citizens don't really understand what this means. A special military operation is essentially saying that Russia was fighting a kind of a Vietnam-style conflict with velvet gloves that, for example, Zelensky, government buildings in Kyiv would not be targeted. Russia wouldn't engage in any additional major offensives. They just try to hold what they have. They wouldn't escalate beyond Ukraine's borders to NATO member states that are actively arming and supporting, training, even in some cases, maybe even pulling the trigger with the case of the British, firing drone attacks against Russia, perhaps the U.S. as well. And now the velvet gloves are likely to come off. And that means, as Dr. Peter Price stated, Russia was actually trained to fight unconventional warfare against NATO forces. And what that means is, we could see counter space attacks that could take out every single U.S. and NATO satellite that's been supporting or feeding intelligence to Ukraine. We could see greatly escalated cyber attacks against the U.S. and its NATO allies and Ukraine itself, most likely. and other escalations. And this I recently wrote an article about how this NATO warnings of World War III with Russia were stood a likely chance of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the more we attack, everything is painted through the lens of kind of Ukrainian and Biden regime propaganda. Where Russia is an unprovoked aggressor. We know that's not the case. They are the aggressor, and they committed a war crime in terms of actually engaging in a invasion of a neighboring country. But that's where the truthful narrative ends. This was provoked massively by U.S. leaders and NATO in terms of inviting Ukraine to join NATO in 2008. There were three different joint NATO exercises with Ukraine in 2021 alone. And then, of course, the Strategic Partnership Agreement, which was signed between Ukraine and Russia. But most importantly, as you noted, the attacks inside Russia itself, which have recently turned out to be CIA directed, essentially.
Yeah, David, this has been a frustrating time period for me. I've actually, with my newsletter, my followers, I've pulled back a little bit from even covering current events because the information that comes out immediately after anything ends up not being true in almost every case at this point. We see political narratives, just this whole Ukrainian war thing. I'm watching CNN give explanations on, that it's completely unprovoked. There's, Putin's just this insane man that just singing "Hoo-yah" and like attacking Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. And then you get a different narrative from Fox News, and then you go onto the internet, some maybe what I would consider some more reliable sources, and you get another narrative, and then you go on places like Twitter, or if you're looking at specific on the ground reporting, where that's actual video. The first one was that attack on the hospital, right? So again, this would have been, I'm sorry, this would have been Israel and Gaza, but where they targeted a hospital and blew a hospital up, and then you saw, and like 500 people were dead, and then when the video from the ground comes out from the site, it's like a little tiny bomb in the parking lot, right? And there's a handful of people, and then you find out it was their own missile, right? So we're seeing this with like all these conflicts, and it's really hard to know what to believe. But I would say probably the biggest narrative going back to Ukraine and Russia is that this was completely unprovoked. I mean, Putin's just this crazy guy, and he just wanted to, he wanted to ride in there on a white horse and take over Ukraine. So can you shortly push back on that and, kind of give people a little bit of a short history lesson as to how this thing even kicked off and why we got where we're at with this?
Well, the immediate trigger, or rather, I guess the original trigger was, of course, Biden's authorization for the February 2014 Maidan coup. There was a book written called War in Ukraine. It was actually written by liberal Democrats, who happen to believe that Biden's manufactured war in Ukraine is a huge mistake. It's a humanitarian disaster for Ukraine, but also bring us closer to an unnecessary nuclear war with the Russian Federation, which is the mightiest nuclear superpower on the planet. So that essentially caused Putin to invade Crimea and also to support Russian separatists in the Donbass region. The very leader that Victoria Nuland, then serving as Assistant Secretary of State, handpicked, that was Biden authorized to be the next Prime Minister of Ukraine, was actually picked. Essentially, he was a puppet. We can't say with certainty that Zelensky's a puppet, but at least that leader was a puppet because he was handpicked by us. That kind of, Putin had already been feeling, less secure with, Bush's regime change operations, with the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, and then with Georgia as well the prior year. But all that led up to, the construction of CIA bases, 12 CIA bases that we're aware of in Ukraine. Of course, we have the biolabs, and I don't think the biolabs are a big issue. There are 24 biolabs that were confirmed by the U.S. Producing biological weapons that could potentially be used by Ukrainians against Russia. And Russia essentially, Putin massed his forces following in March 2021 when Zelensky said in no uncertain terms that he would retake Crimea if by military means if necessary. And that led up to the December crisis, where Russian troops again massed their troops on Ukraine. And on December 7th, 2021, Putin said, "If you just issue us a written guarantee, Ukraine will never become a formal member of NATO. We'll withdraw our troops back to bases." And Biden's told Russia to go pound sand. Then Russia came up with a mutual security treaty, and Biden rejected that as well on January 25th, 2022. And of course. That I predicted that that would just guarantee a Russian invasion of Ukraine that happened on the 24th of February, and 5 weeks later, Russia and Ukraine had negotiated a peace agreement to end the war completely, in what I would call a Ukrainian victory, in which Russia offered to withdraw its troops from 6 of its 8 Ukrainian-occupied oblasts, excluding Crimea, But when Russia actually began implementing that agreement, withdrew from the 3 northern oblasts, the U.S. did an about face. Biden, who had been supporting peace efforts, through mid-March, according to, a retired lieutenant general on Fox News, decided that this was the time to, this was by Putin showing weakness by making this unilateral withdrawal that, he didn't have to do. This wasn't a Ukrainian military victory. It was a decision on the part of the Kremlin to show that it was serious about peace with Ukraine. The whole purpose of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was, yes, it was to prevent the Ukrainian invasion of the Donbass People's Republics that were Kremlin backed, but it's primarily to prevent Ukraine from becoming essentially to reverse its de facto NATO membership status, in which the U.S. had really been successful in expanding, de facto expanding NATO and its sphere of influence and liberal empire into Ukraine.
Yeah, and we've seen since this kicked off. I mean, I don't remember which European leader was talking about now we have to fast track Ukraine into NATO. I mean, there were reasons why we weren't letting Ukraine into NATO. They were considered one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and now they're I remember seeing Vice and New York Times articles on like a couple of years ago, not long after the coup there in 2014. I remember seeing articles on these Nazi-backed battalions and stuff like that. And again, I don't trust Vice and New York Times and some of these left-wing outlets very much, but they were reporting on it, and then those articles disappeared. And now they're all pretending like this was never a thing, and that Ukraine's like this wonderful country, and they're totally to be trusted. We're seeing Macron the other day talking about putting troops in Ukraine, and I think it's just gamesmanship and it's rhetoric and ramping things up. But at the end of the day, I think Putin came back pretty strongly and said, if you start putting troops in Ukraine, it's kind of game time, right? So, and again, that's another narrative that's just, from my understanding, from what I've read, it's just not true. That Putin has no designs on the rest of Europe. This isn't a Hitler-esque, expanding an empire type thing. He had reasons for going into Ukraine. Not saying he should have done it, unjustified. But at the end of the day, that's the narrative that you hear all the time. Oh my goodness, if we don't win here, he's going to move, and he's going to come into Europe, and he's going to go after France and Poland and all these other countries. And it's outright propaganda, in my opinion. A lot of the cases and some of the news. I mean, they just push a narrative because all of a sudden we're on Ukraine's side, we're funding them. In my opinion, I believe we're essentially fighting a proxy war with Russia, and we're using Ukrainian children to do it. We're using Ukrainian bodies to fight a proxy war with Russia. The West is, right, and I think it's going to backfire. I think if at some point, if cooler heads don't prevail, if somebody doesn't pull back from this, it's just going to keep escalating. And so you mentioned how Russia has now declared war on Ukraine. Where do you see this going forward?
For the first time, I see a very real risk of. Looks like you might have been muted. For the first time, I see a very real risk of World War III with Russia. And by World War III, I mean a direct war between Russia and NATO. Initially, I thought maybe Macron's statements were, more posturing, strategic posturing to try to show solidarity with Ukraine. But the more I've read into them and UK proclamations and, Poland, of course, that sent up to 20,000 volunteers to fight Russia directly in Ukraine, maybe more like 12,000 actually. It seems actually likely that we're going to see a massive Russian offensive, likely in the summer, that will materialize in the next 2 to 3 months, likely from the Kharkiv region. As I've been predicting the last 2 years, that could cut off all of Ukrainian forces in southeast Ukraine by driving all the way to the Dnipro River line and then heading south, rolling up that entire stretch of territory for Russia. And that would likely, I think, most likely will cause, and I've been dismissing this for many, many months. Dr. John Mearsheimer has been warning about this, and now I am as well, that that could cause Britain, France, and Poland, and perhaps even some Baltic states to send, kind of an ad hoc NATO expeditionary force, because NATO, of course, doesn't have, with 32 members, every single one of them would have to unanimously declare war on Russia to authorize, this type of operation. So it would be essentially a coalition of the willing, much as we did during the second Iraq war with kind of the U.S. and Britain, really. Just a few NATO countries sending tens of thousands of troops. And the purpose of this expeditionary force would be to defend the Dnipro River line. So it would be to defend Kyiv, defend central and western Ukraine from Russia, as well as the Belarus direction, so that Russia couldn't pounce on Kyiv from the north, which is, I think, Kyiv is always
hasn't real quick. Hasn't Putin always said that's a red line for him, for NATO forces to be in Ukraine?
He has, yeah. He stated that's a nuclear red line. Now, I don't think that. I do think it's a nuclear red line, but I don't think that Putin has shown tremendous strategic forbearance, and I don't want to encourage NATO leaders to do this, but I don't think that Putin would react immediately with nuclear forces. I think he would go right up the escalation spiral. So as soon as NATO combat forces cross the Ukrainian border in force, we'd see a massive counter space attack. And if that failed to deter, cause them to retreat, then we could see massive cyber attacks. And that could be not limited to, NATO forces in the region. It could be NATO wide. It could be US wide, North America, because on any, at any given time, Putin could use either super EMP weapons as we've been alerting the American people about, or cyber weapons to essentially collapse the United States and to prevent us from being able, not only preventing us from being able to surge additional military forces to theater, but also to essentially cause our government to collapse and tens of millions of Americans to starve to death. So, we're playing with nuclear fire. We're playing with EMP fire. That's a term that Peter Pry used before his untimely death. And we're playing with cyber fire as well. And any one of those three weapons could see the end of Western civilization.
Yeah, I liked the descriptor you used earlier, kind of in the sense that Russia's kind of fighting a Vietnam War, in the sense that they've had these white gloves on, and they have the technology and they have the ability to do much more to Ukraine than what they're doing. I would agree, Putin has shown great restraint in the face of certain things happening in his country. We did see his retaliatory strike strike here 3 days ago where he started attacking the Ukrainian electric grid again and started bombing their electric grid. That's something he could have been doing the whole time. It takes a long time to replace a high voltage transformer in a country like that. And so, I mean, that's always been the concern is, are we going to allow this to escalate, right? How do we prevent it from escalating? The war of words, giving more weapons, inviting Ukraine into NATO, or saying we're going to fast track that, when that's the one thing Putin didn't want them to do in the first place, right? All
Right.
these things are like literally poking the bear in the eye. We're just, and that's because we just keep poking and poking and poking and prodding and poking. At some point, that bear is going to take a swipe back. And like you said, I don't believe that he's going to all of a sudden start using tactical nukes either. But I think cyber could definitely ramp up. I think you could see different systems. I don't know that he's going to go the full nuclear option and take out electric grid via cyber, but he may take regions down. You may start seeing water facilities or sewage facilities or other critical infrastructure outside of the electric grid. I think he would probably start there. We were warned about this before he entered Ukraine. There was one of his close advisors, I can't remember her name, was on national TV saying that she expected this war to basically escalate this way. I think she probably expected it sooner, but these things would happen, and then we would poke and they would poke, and it would just escalate. And she actually came out and said, and then once it gets so far, they're going to take the electric grid out in Atlanta and Washington, D.C., and then we're going to black out in Moscow. And she said, then we're going to hit them with an EMP and take out their entire electric grid. That was her take before this even kicked off. So these are concepts and theories. As the EMP task force, we are constantly getting information on this. We're constantly discussing it, but the American people don't understand the risk of a large region or the entire country losing the electric grid. So again, so we're going to see this again. We got to wait and see how it plays out, and we're going to hope that somebody in the current administration has the wisdom to kind of try and put the brakes on this whole thing and slow it down. It just seems like we just keep, like Russia has this red line and we just keep sticking our toe over it a little bit further, and he moves the red line back a little bit and we stick our toe over. I hope he keeps doing that. But, this latest attack in Moscow that we talked to at the beginning of the interview here, I forget how many dead, but it was a pretty gnarly attack.
133 so far.
What's that?
133 so far.
Oh wow! I haven't checked the news this morning. I didn't know it was that high, but that's a lot. That's a lot. And I know ISIS took credit for it, but some of the video evidence and some of the stuff that the Russians are putting out does raise some questions on that as to where these guys actually came from and who actually paid them to do this. So, yeah, typically ISIS use ISIS guys to do their attacks. They use in-house terrorists that they get into a country to do their tasks. These guys sound like they were hired. They were given 500,000 rubles. They were given AK-47s. They were given the stuff to carry it out. So that's that. Who knows? We're gonna find out. But either way, it doesn't spell good news for Ukraine, Russia. So I'd like to pivot here real quick and and discuss the current events with China and Taiwan and where that currently sits, that scenario. I know over the Super Bowl break, there was a big cyber intrusion. It's been there for a long time. They finally found it. It's called Volt Typhoon. The Chinese had embedded into a lot of our different infrastructure, especially our electric grid energy infrastructure. We're seeing massive amounts of we're seeing large amounts of high voltage transformers coming from a company, JSHP, out of China, which we know are putting backdoors in their transformers. The Trump administration put a stop to that with an executive order, and that executive order was overturned when Biden came into office, and now this same company is putting those transformers in. I've seen two recent articles on the batteries that we're purchasing from China to put in our large solar arrays in the electric grid. We're seeing Joe Weiss. He's been reporting for a decade on the SCADA equipment and how a lot of that stuff's coming from China. It seems like they're all throughout our grid at this point. So feel free to jump in here, David. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on where this China-Taiwan situation is headed?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's we now have at least 466 large Chinese transformers in the grid, and these are transformers that weigh 250 pounds or more. So these are extremely difficult to replace. They're almost the displacement of a U.S. Gunboat, patrol gunboat that's used to train Navy SEALs that weigh about 280 tons, and we have 3% in reserve. So I haven't done the math to find out what percentage of our transformers overall are Chinese built, but I think it's about 9 to 10, maybe 11%. And of course, we had the 60 Minutes interview, I think, with Mike Mabey and some other, grid experts, in which it was stated that, even as few as 9 out of 55,000, what do they call them? Substations. If they were taken out, it could take our grid down for up to 3 weeks. Just imagine if China sent a satellite signal and turned off 10 or 11% of our large transformers. Yep. It would take out the grid really likely for good, unless we could, unless and until we could get the large transformers to replace them or bypass them. And that would be before any Chinese cyber attacks. So, we go to war with China, it's going to be, a lot the same as if we go to direct war with Russia. But it's probably going to happen even faster in terms of the escalation spiral. The counterspace and the cyber would probably be day one, certainly within the first 3 days of a direct war with China. Because really, the side that strikes first has the advantage, whether it's a nuclear first strike, EMP. Of course, we don't have super EMP weapons, and cyber as well, and counter-space weapons. We reportedly have a top secret counter-space network that's a satellite system that's very effective. But if Russia or China take them out first, that our ability to use those weapons to take out enemy satellites will be severely degraded. And that would apply to cyber attacks as well. The director of the FBI recently gave some open source testimony on how bad the Chinese cyber threat is, and he said if every single FBI agent that's in the field were singularly purposed to oppose Chinese try to counter Chinese cyber attacks, they'd still be outmanned by 50 to 1. So, China reportedly had a Chinese hacker army of at least 60,000 troops. I suspect that number may be as high as 90 or 100,000 today. They are, and even with all that, they're still second. They're not even the greatest cyber threat in terms of cyber capabilities. Russia has been assessed as having the best cyber offensive capabilities in the world by U.S. intelligence. So, China's trying to catch up to Russia, but essentially they're kind of at the same level. And the U.S., we have decent, cyber offensive capabilities, but we're far, far more vulnerable to cyber attacks than Russia and China are. Our cyber defensive capabilities are really, Biden's been doing some good work on that, but we're still way behind the power curve. Of course, they're doing nothing at all to defend the U.S. against nuclear missile attack or super EMP attack. So these are huge vulnerabilities. Basically, China has ticking, cyber time bombs in our military networks, cyber networks, that they would activate in the event that Biden made good on his pledge to defend Taiwan militarily. And as I wrote in my article about the likely October surprise timeframe for China to blockade Taiwan, this is likely to materialize in the next 7 months or so. Essentially, I've been warning for several years, since at least 2020, that Xi Jinping has set a date for reunification for Taiwan, not 2049 or even 2027 has been misreported, but likely by 2025. And the Biden presidency essentially is kind of represents a window of vulnerability that I don't think that Xi Jinping can withstand the temptation to utilize to attain a reunification, before potential Trump victory in November. So the time frame is pretty clear. It's been clear for a while. I was contacted by email by someone I believe to be a Chinese intelligence agent, and in response to one of my articles, the national interest, and I responded by saying, "Hey, I think if you represent the Chinese government, I think you should lay out a clear timeline that that China's gonna not take no for an answer and reunify by the end of 2024, by December 31st, 2024." And he went silent after that. It's as if I knew his time, China's timeline, and I can't vouch for that, but I thought it was pretty telling that he didn't respond to that at all. But I think that's it. And we've the incoming commanding admiral of Indo-PACOM, I think it's Admiral Paparo, has stated that China is frighteningly close to being able to move from a military drill to a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, or a major offensive against Taiwan from a standing start with no strategic warning. So this is not a threat that's I watch Taiwan seminars, China seminars, at least 2 a week, it seems lately. And they're all saying, oh, it's not till 2027. We still have a few years. We can arm Taiwan. We can do all these defensive measures. We can upscale our naval forces in the region. And we just don't have the time, and so when you're outmatched as the U.S. currently is by the Sino-Russian military alliance, nuclear, we're probably outmatched 5-1 in currently in operational strategic nuclear warheads. Tactically, it's 35-1 in against Russia. They have 35 times more tactical nuclear weapons than we do. The U.S. has no tactical nuclear weapons in theater in the Pacific. We're completely massively overmatched by China. And in that field, they have at least hundreds of non-strategic nuclear weapons they could use in the Far East and the Western Pacific. We have to pursue a diplomatic solution. And so I actually came out with a diplomatic solution in which I said that not only can and should the U.S. declare strategic clarity with regards to Taiwan, not as the neocons seek to do by saying we'll defend Taiwan no matter what, or Biden has done, but rather the opposite, by saying that the U.S. will not defend Taiwan militarily. Then we can ensure that China has no reason to attack us. And this wouldn't be a sign of weakness. It would, we could, at the same time we said that, we could say we're gonna step up the economic war against China. We're gonna, double or triple the size of our nuclear arsenal. We're going to go to DEFCON 3 on a permanent basis until the Taiwan and Ukraine crises are eliminated, or I would argue completely revamp the DEFCON system to take out DEFCON 4 and 5 entirely. So we're always on 24-hour alert in terms of, bomber strip alert, never having the president and vice president in the same city at the same time. Just to take that off the table, where, currently they could engage in a nuclear decapitation strike that could take out all 3 nuclear footballs and render a new president, sworn in, like Speaker Johnson, for example, unable to launch a nuclear retaliatory strike for days. So they could destroy our nuclear arsenal at their leisure over a 3-day period. So, the U.S. has never been this vulnerable. They could use, our enemies could use super EMP to take us out in a matter of minutes with little and no warning, perhaps no warning at all with the super EMP satellite. And there's nothing we can do about it.
So your specialty is geopolitical, nation state type. And you don't have to answer this. You can tell me it's just not something you want to answer. But I'm also curious because a lot of the chatter is election related, right? I mean, I'm getting a lot of chatter, people asking me, what do you think is going to happen at election time? What do you think is going to happen at election time? And I don't have any special insight. Is that something that you've looked at? Because who was it? Ron Paul the other day was talking about a false flag, and we've had like 4 or 5 people, someone from even the Biden administration, talking about a false flag. But whose false flag from which side, right? So I don't know. There's a lot of people that are predicting a lot of craziness happening around the November election season either way. So what are your thoughts on that?